And we're live again. This is Great Books for Men with another great broadcast, and it also goes for the rest of you as well. And tonight we have a very good review out of center left field, and it is The Secret Conversations of Henry Kissinger. Yes, it's a joke. It's a play. And it's by the Israeli journalist Madi Golan, who ended up, I believe, being on the Jerusalem Post or one of the primary, he was like the senior editor of one of the primary newspapers in Israel and died a couple of years ago. And I thought this was a very interesting book to talk about, especially in the fact that the centenarian Kissinger recently passed away, and his legacy has definitely altered over time because, for example, in the early 90s, all you heard about was, from my perspective or from my background, that Henry Kissinger said in the future the people in Los Angeles, I'm paraphrasing, will welcome the United Nations blue helmets, whereas right at this period of time they would receive them with hostility, but in the future they will welcome them. So this statement was one of the preeminent statements behind the formation of the militia movement and the idea that the United Nations might somehow invade the United States and occupy it in its quest to create a one world order, a new world order, if you will, or if they would, whatever, the Bushes would. But in any way, this is one of the realizations of all things I have to credit Curtis Yarvin with. He said, wait a minute, this is the one salient point I think he ever made, and that is, we are the beast. The beast is not overseas. We are the beast, we are the origins of the evil. It's not the rest of the world. So, passing over time, we realized that Kissinger was not actually endorsing or predicting an occupation of the United States or Los Angeles by the United States or United Nations blue helmets. He was using it as an example, or making an analogy, if you will. Did I say if you will already? That's not good. So Kissinger has kind of aged better than one might think he would have. And so his whole point of view is pretty interesting. And this book is pretty interesting. And I thought I would go into the background of this book. It begins with a very long preface. And, well, it begins with a prologue, which is not the same as a preface. And it tells the story of, no, I take that back. It actually does have a prologue, as I said. I was correct the first time. And it tells of the author's struggles to get the book published. And the reason he had a lot of troubles getting the book published was that Kissinger was a very media aware guy, so to speak, very knowledgeable, they say media savvy guy, and he was always cultivating the media. And consequently, the Israeli government was actually afraid to have this book published, even though the book was from the perspective of an Israeli nationalist. And Golan went on to write a book called, what is it called? Look it up here really quick, but while I'm doing that, I'll keep talking about this. His background was writing this book in favor of Israel and basically arguing that Kissinger had in fact made Israel's experience more difficult due to his negotiations with the Arabs. In other words, even though Kissinger was a Jew, this author, Golani, believes that Kissinger did not properly favor Israeli interests. And this was the crux of the book. And consequently, however, the Israeli government was forced to censor him and aggressively censor and even confiscate his manuscripts to prevent them from being published in Israel or overseas for the specific reason that they did not want to antagonize Henry Kissinger. So very interesting. So Golan went on to write a book called With Friends Like You, What Israelis Really Think About American Jews. And I was thinking of him the other day because Baruch, what is his name? Baruch on Twitter. Baruch, I want to say his name correctly so you can check him out. And no, I yield to no one, not even Il Ragno in anti-Semitism. But I do like Baruch on Twitter. I can't think. Baruch Kogan, I think is his name is, and he is a settler and an extremely Orthodox Jew in Israel, and I feel that his perspective is interesting because it is broadly criticizing the Israeli government and all of its policies while breaking the law in Israel and existing in the territories, so to speak. And so he's taken land and is part of an operation which is routinely attacked as often as the Palestinians are by the Israeli government and the Israeli armed forces. So they routinely roust the settlers out, burn down their houses, and chase them out of those occupied territories because they do not want the Israeli settlers pushing on the Palestinians, so to speak. But they still do the same thing to the Palestinians. So it's kind of an interesting outlook from an anti-Semite's perspective. And consequently, I find Baruch's perspective very interesting for this reason. And plus, he's very witty. He actually reminds me a lot of Il Ragno, God rest his soul, and makes me wonder if Il Ragno had a little Yehudi in the woodpile, so to speak. But that's neither here nor there. Baruch Kogan, at Baruch Kogan on Twitter. So yeah, if you want to check him out. But Golani wrote this book, and he writes from an Israeli nationalist perspective and is very hostile of American Jews for their ostensible lack of support for Israel. Yeah, from that Israeli perspective. So it's very interesting to observe all these different perspectives than, shall we say, the run-of-the-mill anti-Semitic perspective, because I believe you should have a very urban anti-Semitic perspective, and this was the 10% that Bill Buckley lacked that led him to a rather desultory end. So I highly recommend that you read up on Mati Golan and his books, because I don't seek to alter individuals' anti-Semitism. I'm just seeking to, as I use the word, culture it earlier, and I think that's a proper way of talking about it. You need to have a broader perspective, because we lack this broader perspective on Henry Kissinger in the early 90s. And it's true that Henry Kissinger was, by and large, a moderate in every sense of the word, but overall, I see his perspective as being appropriate. And Henry Kissinger, in many ways, was not the problem with anything that ever happened wrong in the United States, because Henry Kissinger, despite being more masculine than anybody who's ever going to watch this broadcast, bottom line, Chairman Mao said so. Are you going to argue with Chairman Mao? Are you really going to argue with Chairman Mao? People say, "Oh, look at Chairman Mao, little fat guy." Chairman Mao is more masculine than you. It doesn't matter how little or fat he was, or how he had them himself carried around China. he was a librarian, this and that. They actually tried to kick him out of the Communist Party for being a fascist in the 1920s. But the point of the matter is that Chairman Mao had the right perspective on Henry Kissinger. And I feel that Kissinger did have the feminine quality of trying to accommodate the powers that be, which is not exactly a major problem in life, and everybody does it to one extent or another. So are you going to complain that Henry Kissinger, tried to basically get along with Nixon and agree with him on a lot of things? And had there been a more urbane, harder right version of Nixon, had there been a smarter Congressman Ashbrook, then perhaps Kissinger would have, accommodated himself to their beliefs. Hell, Kissinger would have accommodated himself to Hitler's beliefs if it meant power and success for Kissinger. So, Kissinger did play the part of a woman in that regard. He had a very feminine mindset. Now, supposedly in the past, people have said that Kissinger was actually some sort of concentration camp or used individual, like he was some sort of sex slave in his younger days, and that I can't prove or disprove any of that. I've heard similar rumors about Soros. I don't know. I'm really not going too deeply into that. I want to focus on the book preeminently, and I wanted to talk about this book specifically because it gives us a perspective that we're not used to. And unfortunately, a lot of people, when confronted with a perspective with which they are not familiar, which has overwhelming evidence in its favor, it simply sways them to its side. Whereas I'm not necessarily saying give up, or I'm not saying at all give up anti-Semitism. I'm not even saying I am in favor of Baruch. I'm just interested in his perspective because Baruch is not technically my enemy. Baruch is against taking money from the United States. Baruch believes that the United States is at the root of Israel being unable to finish off all its enemies and basically recreate the kingdom of, as it was in the days of King David, from what was it, from the Euphrates to, from the Nile to the Euphrates or something like that. Was that? I believe the kingdom of David ran from the Nile to the Euphrates. So that's what his goals are, because David is the single heroic figure besides the Maccabees in Israeli or Jewish history. So that's understandable from his perspective. But again, perspectives. Think about how we viewed Henry Kissinger as a globalist in the 90s. Such a horrible globalist, such a harbinger of terrible things to come. And then it turns out over time disproves that. Now, were time to work out differently, I think we would find that Kissinger was on whatever side happened to be the winning side. And this is very interesting because in the case of Israel, long term, obviously, Nixon and Kissinger were both convinced that they were not, in fact, the winning side. So it's very interesting to observe Kissinger's diplomacy in action. Now, I had years ago figured out a couple of things that Golan was actually an error about, and they come from the diaries of somebody who was involved with these, or it may have come from one of Pat Buchanan's reminiscences. Yeah, that's the way you pronounce it. Of the Nixon years when he was Nixon's staffer. I cannot remember, but their accounts contradict certain things that Golan says, and I can't for the life of me remember what it is. But I'm going to read various extracts from this book talking about Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy and how he ended up at odds with the Israeli government. Now, to briefly recount the situation with Israel, we had a very interesting situation, just like we did in the Falklands with Thatcher, is that the Egyptians decided that Israel having a woman as the head of it was easy prey for them. And they crossed their T's and they dotted their I's. They waited for Sharon to retire from the military, and they took every precaution to find Israel as weak as possible so they could attack. And consequently, the Israelis were quite shocked and hurt, and they responded with a maximum amount of aggression. And at one point, Moshe Dayan had a nervous breakdown, which, he was Jewish, so they have nervous breakdowns. Who was it? The other guy. As Yitzhak Rabin had a nervous breakdown in the 1966 war, and Dayan had replaced him as one of the leading generals in Israel. And Dayan had a nervous breakdown in 1972 or 3 conflict. And so the situation was dire, and the Israelis were contemplating using their Samson option, the nuclear weapons, and so forth and so on. But, things turned around, as we know. There was the airlifts. Sharon drove into Egypt, and, things changed for the better. And then along comes Henry Kissinger to settle the matter. And I'm going to be talking about Kissinger's negotiations starting from page 151. After leaving Cairo, Kissinger flew on to meetings with King Faisal in Riyadh and Syrian President Assad in Damascus. Then on December 16th, Kissinger's specially built Boeing 707 landed in a driving rainstorm at Ben Gurion Airport near Tel Aviv. This time there were protest demonstrators at the airport instead of crowds welcoming the hero of the ceasefire. They carried placards which read, Kissinger deserted Formosa. Is Israel next? And America, et-tu, brute? There were only a few dozen youngsters from the right-wing movements, but they reflected a growing public uneasiness about Kissinger's real intentions. It was no secret that Kissinger was beginning to pressure the government. Since 1967, the public had taken it almost as an axiom that the territories were Israel's best bargaining card, to be surrendered only for full peace. Now they were beginning to hear rumors of a one-sided Israeli retreat. Still, at this early date, Kissinger did not have that much persuading to do. In a meeting with the Israeli negotiating team that evening, the official position of an exchange of banks with the Egyptian forces was dropped fast. Instead, a 10-kilometer retreat from the canal was offered. And it was Allen who, in 1970, had opposed allowing any Egyptian troops on the east bank of the canal, who now told Kissinger that Israel would agree to some Egyptian forces on the east bank. It was clear that conditions had changed radically. The Israeli ministers were only insistent on 2 points. Israel would not retreat beyond the Mitla and Gidi passes, and the level Sadat was contemplating of Egyptian military forces on the East Bank was not acceptable. The nervousness in that meeting came only when Kissinger, sounding a little like the Harvard professor of old, started lecturing the Israeli ministers on his general strategy. Kissinger explained that the aim of the disengagement talks was to circumvent the need to talk now about borders and final arrangements. The success of the talks would also lead to another achievement, the lifting of the oil embargo. This would also end Israel's isolation by easing the pressure and put on her primarily by the Western European states and Japan. No one in Israel should have the slightest doubt, warned Kissinger, that the failure of disengagement talks would break open the dam holding back the pressures on Israel, this time not for a partial retreat, but a full retreat to the June 4, 1967 borders. To strengthen his argument, Kissinger told the Israelis he was amazed by Sadat's behavior. The Egyptian president was so far not using his full political power created by the new international situation in negotiating for an agreement. Indeed, Kissinger thought that Sadat could have used the international situation to achieve an overall agreement on his terms. At the most, said Kissinger, Sadat would have risked a new war in which the whole world would blame Israel anyway. Given the situation he had just described, Kissinger recommended that Israel be generous in contemplating a retreat from the canal. He had always believed, he said, that Israel never knew when to give away, since the conflict with Egypt was linked to the international situation, and since, in Kissinger's opinion, Israeli forces on the west bank of the canal were overextended anyway, he thought this was the right time to give way. Mrs. Meir understood the picture that the Secretary of State was drawing. She said it was all justification for a one-sided Israeli retreat, an agreement that was not based on mutuality. Of course, she said, Sadat would put in a lot of pretty words about sending home part of his army or opening the canal. Maybe he would do it, and maybe not. Then she said, is it true that one should also consider the views of Douglas Home, the French, the Europeans, the Japanese? She knew, she said, that even if Sadat were to start a war, no one would regard it as unjust because the justice in Europe was not worth much these days. She continued excitedly. The world wants an Israeli retreat to the 1967 borders, or more correctly, the world wants oil, believing that it will get it after Israel carries out a total retreat. It's very possible oil would actually start to flow after the signing of a disengagement agreement, but what would happen afterward? The oil embargo would be renewed again, and this time with the aim of pressuring Israel to retreat to the 1967 lines. Since this is the case, Israel has to determine for itself when to take on the big confrontations with the world, a confrontation that cannot be prevented. Right now, Israel still has certain advantages. The Suez Canal is in its hands, and its forces are camped on the west bank, 100 kilometers from Cairo. If Israel gives up these two advantages, it would not have anything left as a bargaining chip card for the time when the world pressures it to return to the 1967 lines. Mrs. Meir lit a cigarette with shaking hands and went on. The worst thing is that, as far as the world is concerned, it doesn't matter who is the aggressor. The aggressor and the victim are in the same boat. Not even in the same boat, because the aggressor has oil, and therefore he is just, and the blame falls on the other side. In this world, Israel cannot be just. When she finished, she half turned her back on Kissinger, perhaps subconsciously, as if she were turning her back on the world he represented. In responding, Kissinger made it clear that his view of international morality was just as cynical as hers. After all, he had made even more contacts with heads of state. He cited the Japanese as an example. At a recent meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Tanaka, the subject was the hostility that Japan showed Israel during the oil embargo. Tanaka explained that he was facing general elections and that he had to prove to his people that he was defending their interests. The Prime Minister said that he did not have a Jewish population in Japan, so he didn't have to consider this point. According to Kissinger, this was the most anti-Semitic remark he had ever heard, although it did not surprise him. In any event, he generally assumed the Japanese were unreliable and that one would never know what treacherous acts they would commit behind one's back. The point, said Kissinger, was to try to live with the world as it was. As for Israel, Kissinger thought it had to gain time, an expensive commodity that the disengagement agreement would purchase. Kissinger was more optimistic than Golda Meir regarding another oil embargo. Not that it was impossible, he said, but if the same weapon were used a second time, the element of surprise would disappear. The West would be prepared next time. So, moving on, just briefly shuffling through the book. The book is very readable. It's very straightforward. There's a lot of interesting exchanges. There's a lot of interesting cases, and this goes into describing Kissinger's negotiations with all the actors involved at this period of time. And I thought it was very interesting to primarily read the or a portion of his negotiations with the Israelis to demonstrate Kissinger's lack of necessarily filial or ethnic affinity for the Israelis. I want to read another one here from page 193. While Kissinger was away, Mrs. Meir and Diane held a private meeting in which they discussed the necessity of making a concession on the line of retreat. Diane said that if they had to give in, it should be in the El Quantieri area. He argued that the city itself was not that strategically essential for Israel. On the other hand, in the past it had been a bustling city, the pearl of the Golan for the Syrians. Giving the city to Assad, even though it was completely destroyed in the wars, would satisfy his need for prestige. They then agreed that Diane would privately offer Kissinger an unofficial proposal that Israel would be willing to part with the eastern part of the city. When he got back to Israel on May 5th, however, Kissinger was already insisting that Israel had to give up all of El Quteria and the 3 strategic hills to the west of the city. When the group of ministers emphasized the importance of the hills, Kissinger became visibly annoyed. He viewed their arguments as a transparent attempt to conceal the true Israeli interest, the civilian settlements. The United States, he said, like most other countries, never supported the establishments of the settlements on the Golan Heights in the first place, and it had no intention of changing its position now. Building the settlements was a grave error that reduced the room for territorial compromise in these negotiations and in the negotiations to come. When Mrs. Meir heard him lecture Israel, she jumped out of her seat and confronted Kissinger. What does this mean? What moral justification does Assad have altogether to demand even 1 meter beyond the purple line? After all, it was Syria who, together with Egypt, that started the war. It is not possible to start a war and then complain of an insult when the war is lost. And the same goes for the war of 1967. If the Syrians hadn't started a war, then all the territories they want today would have been in their hands. In the meantime, there have been 2 wars, many wounded and killed. Now Syria just wants to turn and wheel back. Does Israel have to pay the price of Assad's defeats? The only thing Kissinger could say after her outburst was that was he and not she who had to confront Assad the next day. Believe me, he said, that is not at all a pleasant mission. So, again, I read a couple of brief passages primarily to show where Kissinger clashed with the Israelis, and it's kind of striking now because then we go back to the alleged Sharon interview with an Israeli radio station, which he says basically the United States government is a puppet of the Israeli government, and which was used in turn over the years by white nationalists and sundry others, anti-Zionists in general, to basically create or put out the idea that the United States government, which was Zionist occupied territory, which it is, but whether it's quite clear that the United States government does not officially take its orders from the Israeli government. Far from that, the Israeli government is a colony of the United States and, responsible to the United States. So, again, this book is very interesting. It's very straightforward and not specifically biased. It is biased, but obviously, there is a very urban, sophisticated, certain percent of professionalism in journalism that this book conveys. I would recommend, if I were teaching a class in journalism, I would recommend that all my students read this book, because of the way it's written and the way it portrays the different characters and recounts the histories that go on within the book. And again, it's a very straightforward book. A lot of the dialogue is very, succinct and very, it's clearly, there's very little paraphrasing going on. Though how much of it is lost in translation, one wonders, because the book was translated. So I highly recommend that you read this book. I highly recommend that you read it, if for no other purpose, to understand the Israeli nationalist perspective, which again I don't endorse, and again I view them as actively hostile to my personal interests as an American. But you have to appreciate their interests. And again, Baruch Kogan on Twitter, I quite like his book. I feel it's very interesting to read a workman-like book, and when I say craftsman-like book, a book that is properly crafted and put together, which is very rare today, and that's why I say it's a good example for a journalism class of how to write a book describing the situation of the 1973 conflict and how Kissinger was involved within it. And so, we've been going on for 30 minutes, good Lord. And so I would say you can pick up this book for a very expensive price new and a very cheap price used. So I would say get the cheap price of it. And I was going to go into some other things. I was going to read from Madame de Sade by Yukio Mishima as well, but I think I'll spare you that. I was going to read some from Julius Evola as well. May do that tomorrow. I have a whole deal. I'm still trying to contact Retard Whore. She's still ignoring me on Twitter. I intend to keep it up until I'm blocked, or she gives in. It's going to be one or the other, So I'll probably be broadcasting tomorrow. I'm probably going to be doing a few other books, but I do recommend that you read The Secret Conversations of Henry Kissinger. I think we've talked about it years ago, and I think it was brought up. Il Ragno or one of the other resident anti-Semites talked about it in the group, or it might have been Nick posted something on Speakeasy way back in the day. I don't remember specifically, but I know this book has been around. And again, it's not the most honest book out there anymore, because I think some of the information is erroneous at this point that Golan puts in the book, whether it was intentionally placed in the book to be misleading or whether his facts are just incorrect and he meant to convey them in an honest manner that was just misguided. It's hard to say at this juncture, but it's absolutely true that this book is a good example of the Israeli nationalist perspective on situations, and it's a very interesting portrait from a interesting, a nationalist's perspective on Henry Kissinger. They should be best buddies, but they're not necessarily best buddies just because they seem to share an ethnicity. And Henry Kissinger is very loyal to America primarily. He's loyal to the strongest, which is America, and views Israel as one of their minor satraps, obviously. And just because he is roughly the same in ethnicity as those people in that country, he does not necessarily have any primary loyalty to them. So again, it's one of the more nuanced, opportunities for nuance in this world, and nuance is meant to lead us somewhere. It's not meant for us to revel and jerk off in. We're supposed to. You can't just sit there and masturbate in the nuance. You have to use the nuance to elevate to a higher level. That's the whole purpose of nuance. Understanding things, not staying in the same position you are, but hopefully maintaining your prior perspective, and hopefully it only strengthens your prior perspective. I can guarantee you it didn't mind. In any case, we'll be doing some more broadcasts tomorrow. I hope to broadcast early and often, but I might not. So without further ado, like the video, subscribe right now.